Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Jenna LeCount Heinley. I am the CEO of HARC, which stands for Health Assessment and Research for Communities. We are a nonprofit that is very proud to be a part of the Center for Health Disparities. And today I'm very excited about this panel. We will have several panelists, panelists 1 and 2 together, and then 3, 4, and 5, and then we'll take questions. So if you do have any questions, please use the chat box and we will tackle them at the end. So first, I'd like to introduce panelists 1 and 2, Dr. Tanya Neary with UCR's Center for Health Disparities, and also Dr. Allison Tovar with the University of Rhode Island.
Great, good morning. So we should start now? Okay, great. So I will share my screen. Yeah, so okay, are you seeing it? Okay.
Yes, we are. We are seeing it in presenter mode.
I don't know, how do you get it out of that? I have 2 screens. Maybe I should, you know what? Hold on one second. Let's just solve that problem. Let me try again.
Beautiful.
When I have 2 screens on, is that better? That's better. Okay,
perfect.
So, and I'll turn this lens so you can see my face properly. Yeah, it's all about staging, right? Yeah, so Alice and I are here to talk with you today about the Grow El Crecer Bien project, which is a study of infant feeding and its relation to infant growth and obesity. And so we're going to be talking to you about conducting research with moms and infants during COVID-19. So the study has 2 aims. The first aim has 2 parts. Part 1 is, to examine the effect of infant feeding styles and practices on infant growth and obesity at 24 months. And basically, a lot of prior research has focused on what we feed babies, and less research has focused on how we feed babies. What are the interactions around feeding? And so, our goal is to, fill that gap. And we're going to do that by conducting a longitudinal survey of 300 infant mom pairs who are enrolled in early Head Start. And actually, I made this slide about a week ago before we made yet another COVID-related change, which is that we're going to have to drop our eligibility criteria of being enrolled in early Head Start. We're modifying that to being early Head Start eligible, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we're going to collect data from moms and their babies at 4 time points. We have 4 interviews that we're conducting remotely with moms when baby is around 2 months old, around 6 months old, and around 12 months old. And then at 24 months, we aren't interviewing moms, but we are collecting at all 4 time points, including the 24-month time point, length and weight data for the baby to measure growth across time. And then, of course, we can calculate body mass index, which is the sort of standard index of obesity at 24 months. The second part of AIM 1 is really to better understand other caregivers' role in infant feeding. The majority of the research focuses on moms in particular, or parents. But many other people participate in the feeding of babies. And so from the sample of 300, we are recruiting a subsample of 36 moms and asking them to complete feeding diaries to record not just what they feed baby, but who's feeding and how that interaction goes. And then we're doing that at 2 and 6 months when baby is 2 and 6 months. And then at 6 months, we'll actually conduct an interview with the mom and a person she identifies as a trusted other caregiver of the focal infant. And we're going to ask, how do you navigate differences of opinion in how to feed the baby? How do you work together? How do you solve problems together? If baby's really fussy and doesn't want to eat, how do you guys resolve those issues? And we hope that will help us inform our understandings of how moms who participate in early childhood education programs like Early Head Start that have large nutrition components, how they can translate that information, in the context of other people who provide care to the baby, who may not have that same training. So the second piece, the second aim of the study is really to translate everything we learn about infant feeding styles. I'm getting a note telling me my internet is unstable. Can you hear me now? Yeah, so the aim 2 is really to translate those findings to practice. So we will work with Early Head Start to transfer what we've learned into programming that they can provide to the parents. So what we're anticipating is an educational component on styles and practices of feeding and how they relate to infant growth, and an educational component on working with other caregivers in infant feeding. So we've had to make a lot of changes due to our research due to COVID. And the first and perhaps most important is this idea of needing to rethink motivation to participate, and how in the context of COVID, people have a different set and sometimes larger set of competing priorities. And so while they may have been interested in the past, and they might have had more flexibility with their time and energy and sort of mental and emotional space to participate. And now we realize that COVID changes the game. And so what we've tried to do to address that is, given that sort of we view the cost of participation as greater in the context of COVID, so we have increased the financial incentives that we provide. So we pay the people at each time point for their participation, and the original time point was $30, and that has now increased to $50. And at each time point, we have increased, with the idea of hoping to address that issue of motivation. The other thing we've had to do, of course, is to reduce barriers to participation. And of course, one of that means, one of the ways that we do that is, if we're collecting data remotely, you could do a 2-hour interview in person and it's not that big of a deal, but a 2-hour online interview is not going to be possible. And so that's another barrier to participation. Remember, these are moms of infants, and a good portion of the time they're probably holding their infant or attending to them, or other children or other household members. And so we've split our interviews. The first interview is the longest. And so we've split that into 2, and we also shortened it. So it's about an hour, and the content is about an hour and a half, and we split it into 2 time points, 2 45-minute interviews. Allison, feel free to jump in anytime. So as I alluded to in the description of the study, we've also had to rethink who participates in the study. Due to COVID, Early Head Start enrollment of our key demographic, which is mothers of infants 0 to 2 months, has declined significantly. In fact, I just spoke with one county, San Bernardino County, and they said that they're at 57% enrollment. And so, and it's because people are busy and have other challenges they are now having to deal with. And so our goal has been to modify our participation eligibility to increase the pool of people who could participate in our study. So we've done that in a couple of ways. So we have 4 counties: Orange County, Imperial County, San Bernardino County, and Riverside County. And we are now trying to expand to the Early Head Start programs in LA and San Diego counties. And we are also, as I mentioned, dropping the eligibility or the criterion that you have to be enrolled in Early Head Start, and are instead just saying that you have to be Early Head Start eligible. And, we have a list of criteria. So then that's just so that we have comparability in the sample. And then lastly, we've had to modify ways of participating. So obviously we've moved to remote data collection, and we've shortened our interviews. Originally, we planned to collect at 4 time points. We planned to measure ourselves, baby's length and weight. And we can't do that because we can't be co-present with babies. And so instead we are gathering that data from well baby visits, which the participating families give us consent to collect. And then we've had to modify the content of our study to some extent. We're still focusing on infant feeding practices and styles and their relationship to infant growth and obesity, but we felt it was really important to capture information on COVID impacts on families. And not just because it's sort of a general, huge contextual factor, but also because it very well likely may have specific impacts on infant feeding. So we've heard reports about, shortages in terms of infant formula, and not, people concerned about, going to the grocery store, not being able to find formula to feed their babies, for example. And of course, just, general stress on the household can also change the context in which baby eats or is fed. And then we've also had to modify our recruitment. It's really hard to do things remotely, and it's hard to stay in the front of people's minds. All of the staff through Early Head Start who are were originally our primary recruiters, because they meet weekly with families, and all of our data collection is supposed to be part of Early Head Start programming visits. But the Early Head Start staff is also disrupted by COVID, not only probably on a personal level, but also as professionals, because they have to switch to remote learning and things like that, or remote operations. And so we're developing strategies for kind of more personal connections to just try to provide support. Historically originally we were very much working with sort of the administrators, but now we're shifting to strategies where we have more one-on-one contact with the Early Head Start staff. And now that we're shifting to Early Head Start eligible, we're looking to move through healthcare systems like family clinics and pediatric clinics. And so, we will be working to establish relationships with nurses who work directly with families. And then lastly, the second point under this is really just that we also have to acknowledge that just like asking participants in the context of COVID to participate is a bigger ask now than it would have been pre-COVID. It's the same thing with our community partners. And so we've been looking at ways to increase incentives for the staff to participate, and rewards just to acknowledge the, sort of the extra work that they're doing for us. So we've implemented sort of like a recruitment reward system with things like thank you notes and project swag like water bottles and notebooks, and for the Early Head Start staff, things like pens and office supplies, just to, on the one hand to, keep them engaged in the study, but on the other hand to kind of support them in the work that they're doing. And I see a chat here. Is that probably telling me to hurry up? Yes. Okay. And then lastly, we're realizing that we just need to be overall more flexible and be willing to change the design. And we've been in touch with NIH, who is our funder, and fortunately they've been supportive, and in us modifying Plan A to Plans B and C and potentially D. And sort of our fallback measure is to actually modify the study aims if we can't, in this context, achieve appropriate answers to those research questions. Then we can consider modifying the research questions. Allison, did you want to add anything?
I guess it depends on time. I'm happy to jump in the question and answer session too. Jenna, whatever you.
All right. I'd love to hear your input in these last 2 minutes before we transfer to Dr. Wu, but or you can jump in during the Q&A. I know I already have multiple questions.
Well, I can give you a 2-minute addition to that. Thank you, Tanya. And I will bring in my own experience. So I've been in the midst of this. I had an intervention with parents, a home-based intervention that was ongoing and was in the middle of recruitment when all of this happened. And so I will add, I think, one more just very important piece to this is just, it's so hard, obviously, on so many levels, but also within the study. So communication with your study staff and just constant follow up and follow through, because they are really the ones that are sort of on the ground. And in retrospect, we actually lost a lot of our participants in that March-April window because there was so much uncertainty. And if I could go back and do it again, I would have had just clear communication with my, research, the person that was talking to the participants, having at least some guidance. Instead, we waited to see what the university was going to say, and we didn't really communicate things clear. I mean, obviously nobody knew anything, but at least we should have put something out, because we lost a lot of participants in that window. And so I sort of kick myself and be like, we should have had like a plan, you know, just have plans in your studies of like, okay, what are we going to do if this, to have some communication plan. And I think had we followed up with several of those participants sooner, we wouldn't have lost them. So, but I can talk more in the question and answer session.
Thank you both so much. This is so fascinating because of the way you've managed to pivot and to meet the constraints of a pandemic. All right, next up we have Dr. Rachel Wu from the Department of Psychology. Rachel, please take it away.
Okay, can you guys see that? No presenter notes or anything? Okay, great.
Looks great.
So I'll tell you like basically the kind of story arc of our research program, and then how the COVID stuff made us really try to figure out how to make lemonade out of lemons, and then how it's kind of come together in an interesting way. So the story basically is that we had this theory that if you're engaging in real world skill learning, you're going to be able to learn what and how to learn, you'll have motivation to learn and adapt, and then you'll increase your cognitive abilities for learning. All of that leads to long-term functional independence in an environment that's changing over time. So this is something that we do a lot with kids and infants, kids, and young adults, all the way up to like last year of formal education. But then it somehow kind of stops over time, so that, especially with like older adults, for example, we don't have a lot of things in place to help them learn what to learn, how to learn, maintain motivation to learn and adapt and all these things. And so the number one thing for older adults is to maintain functional dependence. But as the world is changing, you can't just maintain, you have to learn new skills to be functionally independent. So we were trying to apply this model to older adults. And so what we, and so part of the idea is that, if you think about it as a car, you have your GPS, your fuel, and your engine all together working. If you don't have a GPS, but you have a lot of fuel and no engine, then it's not going to work. And so it's like all three pieces have to go together. So what we decided to do was before in 2018, before COVID all happened, we got older adults to come in and learn completely new skills, 3 skills at the same time. It was really intensive because we told them at some point things will change, right? You just don't know when or how and whatever, but when things change, you have to be learning new stuff to keep up and not depend on other people to do stuff for you. And so they were like, okay, let's do this, right? So we ran this version, and then we ran, a slightly bigger version with about 30 people. So the first version had like about 6 people. And so what we found over time was that the people who didn't do our intervention, they, this is on the x-axis, this like cognitive abilities, they just kind of maintained their levels over time. And then the first group of 6 people increased over time, and then the red group was the second group. And so this is when the intervention started, and they increased a little bit more over time. And so this level here is kind of where an average older adult would sit. And this is where the average like UCR undergrad is when they do the same kind of exams or the same kind of tests. And this is where the average middle-aged adult is. So we tried to kind of basically bridge this 30-year gap. And it was only like maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks by the time they got to this place, which was really cool. Then on top of that, after 1 year, I don't have the data here to show you, but after 1 year, they're actually closer to young adults. So it's a really impressive set of results, I think. So we had this group of people, and we were, we had been telling them over and over again, things might change. We have no idea how things are going to change. And we ran this other version that was an even bigger, better version with 72 or 73 people on top of the 30 that we already had before. And we were telling them the same thing, like things are going to be changing. You don't know how they're going to change. And we were getting them to learn either 1 skill or 3 skills, 2 hours a week or 6 hours a week, but they were all learning something, right? And they were all getting the message that we have no idea how things are going to change. Things are going to change. When they do change, you got to learn new stuff. So COVID hits week 8 of this 12-week intervention. And we were like, crap, what do we do now? And so this was actually like a real life experiment because things suddenly changed. They suddenly had to learn how to connect with their friends online, how to just completely change their lives, right? And so On top of that though, so we had, before COVID, we also got funding to collect blood biomarkers from these people and get more behavioral measures from participants who were low income or racial ethnic minority. And it turns out that like most of the, there are only 3 interventions, cognitive interventions right now published with more than 20 to 30% of the participants who, or 25% of participants who are low income or racial ethnic minorities. So that that was one of the kind of reasons why we applied for the HDR grant. And so, yeah, in our sample, we have about that amount. And so we want to look at behavioral effects, differential behavioral effects, but then also blood biomarkers. And so we suddenly had this canceled intervention, in-person canceled intervention that we just could not do anything. We could not, continue it. So we applied for some money and we said, okay, we have this unique sample where we told them this whole time, things are going to be changing. You have no idea how they're changing. We're going to stress you out just a little bit to learn something new so that when you actually do have to learn new stuff, you're not going to be as stressed out, right? And so we wanted to compare the people who were in our intervention versus not. And then also, how they, like subjective age, how old do they feel? Do they have a growth mindset about learning new stuff? Like if they suddenly had to learn how to use Zoom, would they just, be very flustered about it? Or would they just be like, yeah, I learned Spanish in this other class, so I can totally learn Zoom, like it's not a big deal. What kinds of learning behaviors they're actually engaging in, how that all led to social connectivity, and then how that would lead to feelings of isolation, loneliness, subjective well-being, and stuff like that. So we had the older adults in the intervention versus not. We also have younger and middle-aged adults because we wanted to see the older adults in the intervention, were they actually more like middle-aged adults or actually younger adults? And just to give you like a slight kind of a hint at what we've been finding. So a lot of people have been coming out with studies showing that older adults have actually been more protected in the pandemic because they, they've been doing okay, like their emotions are still, relatively positive. Turns out the older adults in our intervention were actually more like younger adults with less positive, kind of well-being because they were doing so much more, right? So the reason the older adults were not, who are not in the intervention are kind of protected was because their life didn't change very much. So it tells you how little they were doing maybe, and leading to not feeling that much of a change. So the people who were the most active felt the most change basically, right? No matter what age you were. So, so that's really interesting. And so we're also looking at disparities and resilience as well. And then just a quick kind of thing that came out of all of this is that we then started thinking, well, let's work with the county to get technological access to people who are at risk for cognitive decline, loneliness, and functional health deficits as well. And so we're going to provide tablets and internet access to minority, low-income older adults. And we'll provide them not only this learning opportunity with tailored instruction, but also motivation and resources to do so. And so we'll measure social connectedness, cognition, and function over time. And so, yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really fascinating. I used to be on the board of a senior center, and I know how much of an effort they're making to still, engage with people during this pandemic, and that's really, really interesting. So next, we'll move on to our fourth panelist, Dr. David Bowles from Environmental Sciences. David.
Okay, let me share my screen. Does that look okay?
Looks great.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to update you guys on our interdisciplinary research working group. So we were initially funded in the last round in February of last year. And really this effort in some ways kind of dates back 5-6 years ago, but really started to gain momentum in fall of 2019, September of 2019. And that's because at that time I was contacted by a reporter, Nicole Hayden, who at the time was at Desert Sun in Coachella Valley. And she had reached out to me because of issues around arsenic contamination within groundwater, within drinking water, particularly in certain mobile home parks in eastern Coachella Valley. And she had reached out to me just for some comments about potential health effects of elevated arsenic exposure. And it was around that time when the proposals through HDR were out requesting, for pilot projects. And so I ended up deciding to put one in that was focused on basically this issue, this arsenic issue in Coachella Valley. But really the idea was to try to assemble a team to go after a what's known as a Superfund research program, which is funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is an institute within NIH. And this is really a more of a research-driven program. It consists of multiple sort of R01 level projects that span from basic science all the way out to remediation. It involves core facilities and so on. And so this got funded, the interdisciplinary research working group got funded, and I started assembling a really strong team of people. We had really good momentum to start moving forward with pulling together an application for the Superfund research program. And so our original objective initially was to, again, start to catalyze discussions, develop a strategy, and flesh out focused yet integrated projects and cores for this 5-year SRP application. It's a P42 application. And we had a lot of momentum, and actually the HDR grant really provided that momentum, because like I said, we had been talking about doing this for the last 5 to 6 years and just really never kind of got it together. And this really provided the key sort of stimulus, I guess, to start assembling a strong team. This is a pretty large grant, similar to the U54 that is funding the HDR. The direct costs are a little under 9 million over 5 years, not including indirects, and we were planning to submit in April 2021. And then COVID hit in March, and that was right shortly after our working group got funded. And we had planned to do a couple in-person retreats over the year. We had planned to pay for expert reviews and so on. But the key issue that sort of derailed our ability to go after a P42 application is that, similar to traditional R01 grants within NIH, the success is strongly dependent on your preliminary data that you include within the grant. And we know that arsenic is in drinking water within Coachella Valley, and that people are exposed to it, but we didn't have any biological monitoring data to demonstrate that actually you can detect it within human subjects. And so, of course, because human subjects research was pretty much stopped immediately as a result of COVID, that essentially derailed our ability in 2020 to collect these data that were critical for a P42 application. And then on top of it, I had reached out to the PO for the SRP program in April, and just sort of trying to get a sense of whether the deadline was still, we were anticipating the deadline was going to be April this year. But I was reaching out to the PO to see if the deadline was going to be extended because of campus closures and so on. And she had told me, no, actually, it's going to be pushed up to February instead of April. And sure enough, they announced officially in July that the deadline was going to be February. So basically, that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for that. So at that, in April, we had already started thinking about moving in a different direction. And so what we ended up doing was deciding to, instead of going for a P42, which was, again, going to be specifically focused on arsenic contamination in Eastern Coachella, we decided to sort of pivot to something else we'd been talking about for the last 5 years or so. And that is submitting an application for Environmental Health Sciences Core Center. It's a P30 application, which was also going to have a deadline of this April. It's not as much funding, but This kind of grant does not require preliminary data, and we have on this UCR's campus, we have a lot of fantastic people that have a indirect or direct focus on environmental health, either locally or globally. And so this kind of grant really is a way to try to assemble people in a sort of organized fashion, but also provide core facilities to support research for those that are doing environmental health kind of research, but also those that may be wanting to get into it. And in addition to that, it has a pretty robust pilot project program that about $200,000 per year to support pilot projects. And so we had decided to just go ahead and move forward with this. And Yinsheng Wang is in chemistry. He agreed to serve as lead. He's had a lot of NIEHS funding in the past. And then myself agreed to serve as a deputy director for this P30. And so, so really what we've done over the past year or so, similar to the U54, these are massive applications, almost 1,000 pages long. And so it requires a lot of planning, a lot of meetings, a lot of reviewing drafts of various sections and so on. And so over the last year, since we weren't able to do in-person retreats, we've just had basically many meetings and discussions, all via Zoom, at least on a monthly basis, but actually it's now more frequent as we get closer to the deadline. And we initially started off by discussing the specific needs and sections of the P30. And we really wanted to identify what the overall theme of the P30 is. And that was basically, as you guys know, there are pretty significant environmental health disparities within inland Southern California, and they largely focus on air quality issues and groundwater contamination issues. And so those are kind of overarching themes, and really the idea behind this P30, because it includes a community engagement core that Ann Chaney is going to be leading, the idea here is really to focus the research at UCR, environmental health research at UCR, on local needs that are actually relevant. And then not only just sort of researching, communities, but also trying to identify solutions and mitigation strategies to reduce exposure, for example, to arsenic in drinking water by teaming up with engineering, BCOE, and other colleagues on campus. And so we've made a lot of progress. Actually, we're on target to submit in mid-April. All these sections are written. They've gone through multiple reviews and drafts. And instead of doing the retreats that we were planning to do, we got approval from David Lowe to go ahead and use all of our $2,500 for expert reviews by current and prior P30 directors that really know what it takes to get to succeed and get funded. And we've already received feedback from a couple of reviewers. So this is the last slide. It's just showing kind of the organizational structure of our center if it gets funded. So we decided to kind of piggyback on the branding of HDR at UCR and call it Center for Environmental Health Sciences at UC Riverside. So CEHS at UCR, to kind of give it a common theme with the HDR as well. And like I said, myself and Yinsheng are leading this effort. We've assembled a really, really strong team of really fantastic faculty across multiple colleges, multiple disciplines, because that's really what's needed to actually provide, at the end of the day, provide innovative solutions to really trying to address some of these issues. And so I'll leave it at there and leave it at this slide. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Wonderful, thank you. I foresee us working together in the future.
Good, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Next, we will go to our last but certainly not least panelist. Very excited to have Ilana Bennett, Dr. Ilana Bennett from psychology. So please take it away, Ilana.
Start by unmuting myself.
That's always a good start.
Okay, so It should come as no surprise to this group here that the majority of research is conducted in white non-Hispanic populations. This is really incongruent with what we see in our local community. So for example, UCR undergrads have about 14% white non-Hispanic and about 37% Hispanic. The neighboring Riverside community is even more diverse with about 34% white, but 49% Hispanic. However, enrollments in our research are disproportionately overrepresenting white non-Hispanics, as high as about 50% of the population, and disproportionately underrepresenting Hispanic groups at only about 25%. And this distribution is particularly imbalanced when we start to look at older adults. So I'm part of the UCR Aging Initiative, as well as the psychology department has a lifespan research group where we're all interested in understanding the effects of aging. And so when we start to look at research within older adults, we're seeing, again, this overrepresentation of white non-Hispanics at about 40% of our study participants, and only 7% of our population are Hispanic groups. So that was the motivation for us to apply for a working group through the HDR grant. And the goal of the group is really to identify and overcome barriers to recruitment of individuals from these underrepresented backgrounds, particularly focusing on older adults in the Riverside community. The need for overcoming these barriers is so that we can test for and then ultimately address some differences in racial and ethnic groups. So when your samples are so small, you only have about 75 or 7% Hispanic, you can't even begin to disaggregate your data by racial and ethnic groups. So being able to increase enrollment of these populations is going to allow us to even determine whether there are differences. This will also increase generalizability of our research overall. Currently, our research participants are not reflective of the Riverside community, the makeup of our area, and really the makeup of many portions of the nation. And then finally, it will help us stay in compliance with the NIH Revitalization Act. So it was 17, 18 years ago that NIH required reporting of participation of women and minorities, but it's really up to us as researchers to enforce that, and not just to say we're going to make good faith attempts to recruit these groups, but that ultimately end up being somewhat subpar. So there's lots of need for us to be able to do this, and we were super jazzed to get started. But unfortunately, we have not yet gotten off the ground. So our goal was to build trust with the community, to show value to potential research participants, begin to identify and overcome these logistic factors. And so we had proposed that we would be doing these presentations to community centers. We would host information booths at community events. We would conduct surveys about the community needs. And obviously, we were a few months delayed getting started due to some other issues. And then, right as we were going to get off the ground in 2021, COVID had other plans for us. And it's important here because the older adult underrepresented groups that we were particularly interested in were the most hard hit by this global pandemic. So they were dealing with physical risks to their physical health, emotional health, financial health, and it just felt really not prudent or certainly unsafe to be approaching them about some research that they may or may not be able to participate in. And so the other part of that was, even if we did get them excited about the possibility of participating in research and the value of participating in research, there were no research projects for them to get involved in. It took a few months for people to start converting some of their projects to being able to be conducted remotely. And so the timing was just really poor. So unfortunately, we have not gotten any of our working group activities really off the ground. But if there's any silver lining to what's going on here, it's that the pandemic has really put a spotlight on disparities in both vulnerability to COVID-19, as well as access to and interest in vaccines. And this latter part here, this idea of being interested in the vaccine, is kind of a model for what we are seeing with our recruitment barriers. So we're now having these national discussions about people having mistrust in actual or perceived abuses of the system, people being uninformed or not being aware of how to access vaccines, or in our case, research opportunities, or what the benefits of a vaccine or a research opportunity might be. And also discussions about how to overcome these logistics, how to get people transportation, computer access, how to, if they have conflicts with work or childcare, how to overcome that. And so in a way, it's provided a much broader discussion and a much greater awareness of what the needs are for this kind of intervention, this kind of approach to overcoming these research barriers. And so as research comes online, we're looking forward to starting to explore what are the barriers that specifically affect our Riverside community, and what can we as researchers do to help overcome them. That's it.
Wonderful, thank you. Whoever put together this panel, I'm so pleased because all of your projects are at such different phases. Dave was talking about his application, and Alana's talking about how this was the plan and it didn't happen, and Tanya's talking about, this is what we're doing. It's just so interesting. So the first question I have, selfishly, I guess I'm the moderator, so I get to be selfish. Tanya, you talked about the importance of increasing the incentives, and I 100% agree, especially because many people are hard hit economically. How did you find the money for that? How did you?
Well, so we were going to be doing in-person interviews and across, 4 counties, which, this is Southern California, so everything's really spread out. So we had boatloads of money and mileage in the budget, and we just converted all of that. So we just literally said, and that's how we determined what's the amount we could increase to. It's not like we said, oh, what will it take? Unfortunately, that would be a luxury, if you could say, because then you could have like $1,000 incentives or something like that. But so we just took the entire mileage budget and put it to incentives.
Excellent.
It was something I can't remember exactly, but like lots, like $50,000, $60,000. I mean, it was a huge amount.
That makes sense. My next question, and before I open the floor up, is, many of you have talked about having to shift to online, and Rachel talked about teaching seniors to use Zoom, etc. But how, if at all, have you been able to reach the people who are not technologically savvy or who don't have internet access?
So we've been going through the county, and they have people who are registered to get benefits from them. And so they usually, are calling them or something if they don't have access to, any internet at home. So yeah, we've been kind of going through them to help us out.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Share. Yeah, we were very worried about this last summer when we were redesigning the study. But actually, we were pleasantly surprised that the families had quite a bit of access. And a good portion of that is because of the schools. So a lot of people have devices at home that are from the schools for the other children in the household. And so parents have become, become savvy over time in learning those things. In Imperial County, which is like way bad hit with COVID, they actually have like countywide internet or something like that. So they, that's just like available to people. So it hasn't really been as much of an issue. However, to the extent that it is an issue, we will do phone interviews.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that. Oh, sorry, Alana. Just to piggyback on what Tanya said, part of my intervention was, obviously it was home-based, and we switched to it being, actually our participants preferred doing WhatsApp calls, video calls. But many of them, even if they had the technology, didn't want to be on video. And so we transferred to phone. And so we just, we worked with it. Obviously, we would have preferred to have, a video session, but we did phone, and that worked as well.
I just wanted to chime in and say it's so encouraging to hear that access has not been as big an issue for the local community. One of the things that we shifted to was sort of more national recruitment avenues. So things like Amazon MTurk allows you to recruit. In my case, I'm interested in older adults. But there's a large discussion going on about how internet savvy you have to be, not just to get online, but then to know that you can get paid for participating in these studies, how to sign yourself up to be a participant, how to select, you basically become a professional research participant. And so that really is a very different kind of older adult than someone who is living in our local community. And so finding ways to access individuals who would be more similar to the people that we would be bringing into the lab, I think that's really important.
Dave, what about you? Because I'm based in the Coachella Valley, obviously that's my area of comfort. And I know that many of the trailer parks you're talking about are the least connected.
In terms of
internet or technology.
In terms of how, well, we haven't, unfortunately, we haven't had the opportunity yet to reach out to them. I do actually have, this is sort of a separate thing, not tied to the P30, but I do have a new PhD student that is using ArcGIS to basically map out where the hotspots are in terms of arsenic data, because those data are publicly available from the Water Resource Control Board. And we had a suspicion that Eastern Coachella was a hotspot. But basically the publicly available data has pretty much shown that. I think the tragic thing about that issue is that really arsenic is present throughout the Coachella Valley aquifer, which sits underneath Coachella Valley. But the water district up in Palm Springs, obviously they're treating that water before it's distributed to households within that, within the Palm Springs kind of Palm Desert area. Whereas in Eastern Coachella Valley, unless it's being locally treated or, by like a mobile home park owner, for example, most people are going to be using rural wells that are not regulated. And so they're tapping directly into the shallow groundwater that's going to be, potentially contaminated with arsenic. So yeah, I mean, we haven't had the chance yet to reach out to those communities. We were actually, the student that I have that's working on this, we're hoping that later this year, as things kind of open up again, we're going to collaborate with Ann Cheney to start reaching out to those communities and really seeing if we can get a better handle on the magnitude and extent of arsenic contamination in drinking water throughout, specifically Eastern Coachella, because that really hasn't been done.
Wonderful. We have a small enough group that anybody else who has questions, you can just unmute yourself.
I wouldn't mind jumping in. This is actually for Tanya and Allison. I really appreciated the information that you gave about the many mechanisms that you use to adapt your project over time. I'm wondering if you, I mean, it seems like you were able to still reach the group that you were interested in, but it got me thinking that recording feeding behavior is something that forgetful moms do just on their own without being part of a research group. And so I was wondering if you had considered connecting with any of the apps that provide those services to be able to get much larger samples, basically. It would not give the richness of the data that you're getting from the interviews, but at least some of those feeding behavior informations are recorded.
Yeah, so for the subsample of 36, we do use the Baby Connect app. And remember that we're less interested in like classic feeding information, like what are you feeding, how often do you feed, what time do you feed, how much was eaten. We do collect data on that, but we're much more interested in moms, styles and attitudes and ways of doing things. So, does she value a fat baby because she views a fat baby as healthy? Does she feel like, you don't have to worry about nutrition among babies? They do that when they grow up, kind of thing. So that's more of the kind of thing that we're gathering, but we are using the Baby Connect app, which has been which is great because it's already previously available. Some people already have access to it, and it's also available in English and Spanish. And I guess the English version is free, but you have to pay $5 or something for the Spanish version. So we subsidize that cost for those who need it.
No, please go ahead.
I'm over speaking. I agree. The richness of the data that you're interested in is so important because there are so many cultural differences in how we view babies, like constantly worrying that your kid is just too skinny, like, oh, they keep eating, they're eating enough, but they're just scrawny. So it goes against your views of what health looks like, even though you might be providing the right kind of nutrition for them. So it's great. And I just want to also comment, I think this panel was amazing and super informative. So thank you guys for putting it together.
It is so interesting, those different perceptions of what a healthy baby looks like, and in our research with older children, because that obesity is so hard to measure in those very young children, which is why you guys were going to measure them yourselves and now are doing well baby visits. But we look at, BMI of children 2 and up, and then parent perceptions. And throughout the obesity rates are pretty on par, but the parents of the younger children never think their children are overweight or obese. It's, like when the children start to get older, they start to be a slightly more accurate, although still very, very off. But when they're young, the parents never think that. It's really interesting. Yes, Tanya.
Yeah, a thought came to me while we were presenting. So I think another change that I personally have experienced is my own frustration and disappointment with COVID as a scholar. I'm like, God damn it, excuse my French, you ruined my study.
Yes.
And I think, of course, all of us here are presenting the optimistic, we put on a brave face and kind of adapt. And I do think, we can do that. But I do have to admit that it sucks. And I mean, I'm not, I don't have COVID, and I'm still employed, all those kinds of things. So, I'm acknowledging all of the privileges that I have. But, I also feel like I do need to argue as a scholar. This is, it's like, and it affects me emotionally. And, so Allison is a partner and we have another partner, Anne. And Anne and I also have very different coping styles. And so even when it comes to deciding what strategies to employ in modifying the study, we've had a little bit of tension between us because she copes differently than I cope. Her strategy is a change. We need to change. We need to fix this now. Whereas I'm more of a wait and see, and then we'll change. And so I don't think in the context of COVID, we would have had those sort of opposite perceptions about how to proceed because there wouldn't have been, the stressor wouldn't have been there. And I just think, it's important to pay attention to those things. And so Anne and I in particular have had to talk through some of these things because we're sort of like, wow, what's this tension that never existed before?
HARC is a community organization, so we essentially get hired by other nonprofits and such to do studies. And we got hired by Desert Healthcare District to do this community health needs assessment for the Coachella Valley the month before COVID hit. And what was kind of weirdly personally insulting to me was I crafted this beautiful plan. Our skills are in really reaching the community. So I had community outreach events and I made sure to have sign language interpreters there and childcare for the people with kids and food. And, I was just so proud of how much we thought about all those aspects that encourage community members to participate. And then COVID hit and I'm like, well, Zoom focus groups it is, and it was just sort of like, all of my years of expertise on engaging the community were suddenly just not relevant any longer. Elizabeth, are you excited to do your dissertation data collection now with these adaptations and restraints?
Well, I appreciate both of your honesty because, to be honest, I was really excited to go out. I love interacting with people in person. It's, you really get to know them. And then switching over to just everything being online, I really had to think about, is this how I want to move forward? Do I wait? Do I go ahead and start? And I decided to just go ahead and do it. But yeah, it's been really awkward and weird thinking. It just seems so abstract and it's just kind of out there. I don't know. It's really, really strange. So it's good to know that I'm not the only one feeling kind of out of whack here.
Far from it. Far, and that decision to wait, that you mentioned and that Tanya mentioned is so interesting. I was a part of a study that was looking at resiliency among long-term HIV survivors. And the thinking has been, well, okay, let's put that on hold because resiliency during COVID looks very different than resiliency normally. But as COVID continues, resiliency during COVID is becoming resiliency normally, So this is no longer a brief thing. This is the new normal, as people keep saying. So the generalizability is really an interesting thing to think about. Also, I like how Rachel apparently can predict the future, since in her study, she just told seniors things are going to change and you have to be adaptable. And then things drastically changed.
Yeah, that was pretty awesome and not intended. But like, we wrote a lot of papers that, said it could change in 10 years, it could change in 20 years. We don't know. But when it does change, you have to be prepared and not just rely on other people to help you,
And then all of a sudden it changed in 1 year.
2 days. Because on March 10th, we said we have to cancel everything. And then within a week, everything was like shut down in Riverside County. So, yeah.
I think between Rachel and Tanya's group, you've done a nice job of showing how to make adaptations and stick to the original research question, and how to make adaptations that almost shift you towards a more maybe not more interesting, but more relevant for the current time kind of approach, with the same model in mind. So I think that was also a really great example for the panel.
Yeah, we went back and forth quite a bit with the collaborators and thought, should we just make everything online? And so we said, no, we basically put this project on hold and then got more money to do other stuff in the meantime. So because we didn't want to compromise the original research question because it's such an expensive project that we don't think we can get that same project funded ever. So like basically, if we don't run that project, that research question will never get answered, And so we didn't want to compromise that, that opportunity. So
I think it's interesting, Tanya, you mentioned that the NIH was very flexible with you, whereas Dave had the experience of, no, we're not putting off the deadline, we're pushing it forward, actually. Really shows sort of the diversity in funder responses to this pandemic.
Yeah, and I was going to jump in a few minutes ago and say that's really honestly what's been kind of the most disappointing is the lack of flexibility from funding agencies. I mean, not just with what I was talking about, the P42, but even my own NIH grant, there's been very little flexibility in terms of extending the progress report deadline or even deadlines to submit. And I think NIH seems to be thinking about that now, but it's like, I'm sorry, a little too late. We're a year into this.
Yeah.
So that's been, and I know that doesn't apply across all funding agencies. I've heard of other funding agencies, either local or at the national level, that seem to be more flexible. But at least my experience with NIH, I don't know if you guys had the same experience. They have not been flexible at all, and that puts a lot of pressure on PIs and faculty because if you're only able to get, let's say, a 1 year no cost extension, and we can only fund our students for so long, right? And if they're not able to continue making progress toward their degree, then we're going to have to be flexible in terms of what we expect and in terms of meeting graduation requirements and things like that. So it's kind of a trickle down effect that puts a lot of pressure and stress on people in this kind of position. And I agree. I mean, we're obviously very privileged to even have our jobs and have our health, but But at the same time, that's been, from a professional perspective, that's been pretty stressful.
I've also heard of this mythical unicorn of funders who are converting their grants to general operating support, or, you know, being extremely flexible. I have not experienced that. Sounds lovely.
I will say
Yeah.
that NIH they did allow an extension for early career, like early stage investigators, but I believe it was only a 6-month extension. Whereas, as you said, I do neuroimaging research and the scanner has been closed for going on a year now. So it's not, 6 months is great. I'll definitely take it, but I'm at least a year behind. So it doesn't fully close that gap.
Yeah, and I should clarify, you know, it was the scientific officer who was flexible. They're like, yeah, you can change your design and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, we've been getting a lot of pressure to spend money because we're not spending any money. You know, we're in March, we're in year 3, but it's as if we're at the beginning of year 1. Yeah, so we are way behind. And I think, you know, we do worry very much about budgetary implications. You know, are they going to fund us, you know, over time? Because for the last 2 years, we barely spent any money.
Well, thank you all so much. We are at time. It is 10:10. And so now it's my understanding, and Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong, that you'll all have an invite to switch to the next session of your choice. But I have really, really enjoyed this, and I'm so glad to be part of this. And I loved hearing about all of your research. It's just fascinating.
Thank you.
All
Thanks for
right.
moderating, Jenna.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.